Hello and welcome to Trinity, if to a virtual Trinity. My name is John Marrenbon, and I'm the fellow in charge of organising our invited lectures. Among these series, every 2 years, we have 4 Birkbeck Lectures on church history. Now, Gilles Kepel, who is one of the world's leading experts on the Middle East and Islam, would probably find it odd to hear himself described as a church historian. But we take church history in the very widest sense to include the study of all religions, not just Christianity, in their relation to society and politics. Gilles Kepel had been invited and had kindly agreed to give this year's Birkbeck Lectures. And it will be no surprise to any of you that they have had to be postponed. But we're hoping that the full set of lectures will take place live next academic year as soon as possible. In the meantime, Professor Kepel has offered us what he calls a taster, a chance for us to sample some of the themes and ideas which he will be exploring in more depth and detail in his full set of lectures. And in doing so, he offers us a first chance at Trinity to put one of these invited lectures in streamed online live form. Professor Kepel is the chair of the Department of Middle East and Mediterranean Studies at the conglomerate of elite Paris institutions, which is known as Paris Sciences Lettres, and also of the Middle East Freethinking Platform at the University of Italian Switzerland at Lugano. He's the author of many books which have been translated into various languages. Most recently, just this year, Columbia University Press produced a translation of his work into English called Away from Chaos, the Middle East and the Challenge to the West. Before I hand over to Professor Kepel, I should just say a quick word about questions. Professor Kepel has kindly agreed to take questions. The way in which you have to put them on this particular online platform is in writing. You'll see a little Q&A device on your screen, and if you click it, you have the chance to write a question, and you can do this at any time during the talk or wait until after it. Professor Kepel will have this list of questions which he can then address when he's finished his lecture. So please do think what questions you'd like to ask, and let me, without further ado, hand over to Gilles Kepel, who is going to talk about Middle East and Mediterranean region after the COVID challenge and the oil market crash. Thank you, Professor Kepel.
As I mentioned, I'm extremely glad to be able to deliver that lecture in a digital mode from a former British territory, which is the most southeastern part of France, Menton, which is also my family town, Muscat Rasi, as they say in Arabic. And as a foretaste to the lectures that I hope, God willing, or COVID willing, I don't know how we should say that now, hopefully in the spring term or semester in Cambridge. Let me sort of give you a few hints at what I wanted to talk about in what is not Europe anymore, but which is now Britain. The Middle East is actually hit by the COVID-19 pandemics, as is the rest of the world. It's hit in its own way because we're talking about a relatively young population And as we know, the targets of COVID-19, the dead and the victims, are very often elderly people. But they are also people who have health problems, who suffer from diabetes, who suffer from insufficient nutrition and the like, and all the illness which is linked to poverty. And in significant amounts of countries in the Middle East, this is very much the case. Also, the peak that was reached in Europe last month, and which is now in the process of being reached in the United States, which is at its first steps in Latin America and some African countries and Russia, is probably also starting in many Middle Eastern countries. So we haven't seen the full picture yet. But the Middle East is struck by something which coincides and which even predated the pandemics, which is the oil prices problem, the crash of the oil prices. And the Middle East region, or as we say in my country, France, the Mediterranean and Middle East region, has been linked in a sort of unique way to the world system since the mid-1970s by the fact that it controlled this commodity of commodities that was hydrocarbons, i.e. oil and gas. That started with the October 1973 war between Israel and its Arab neighbors. This war was also known in the West as the Yom Kippur War because it coincided on purpose with Jewish Yom Kippur holiday where people don't go to work, and as such the Israeli army was largely off guard. But it also coincided with the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, where when you're not supposed, if you're a pious Muslim, to drink, eat, and a few other things between sunset and sunrise. Going to the battlefield, even if it was in October, which is not the hottest of months, but it's hot all the time in the Sinai Desert, for instance, going to the battleground with your stomach empty and with thirst is not the best of conditions. But if you fight because you have to fight for the sake of the community of Muslims, then religious scholars will call this war jihad, which is usually translated into European languages as holy war or a sort of crusade in reverse, if you want. Because if Muslims cannot fight for Islamic territory, and if they are destroyed, then there will be no more Islam. So jihad does not, if it's implemented, does not compel you to abide by religious rules such as fasting during Ramadan. The aim, to some extent, justifies the means, just like, in a way, to use a more secular comparison, when you're at war and when there's a state of war, military law takes precedence over civilian law or civil law, and so on and so forth. So this war of October 73 was the beginning of the present era in the Middle East. And maybe this era where oil was so important and gave to the petromonarchies, the oil kingdoms or sheikhdoms or oildoms, if you want, of the Arabian Peninsula, such clouds, this may well be on its last legs. Why is that? And in those series of lectures at Cambridge, those Birkbeck Lectures, I'm going to try to sort of rephrase the history of this quasi half century that just ends now, and that to some extent has coincided with my life as an Arabist and as a specialist of the Middle East and the Muslim world, and as a political scientist. A half century which I have not only studied, but I also was a witness of many events. I was on the spot. I met with many people, from commoners to princes, and from military, government, opposition, prisoners, Islamist radicals, and I even was finally sentenced to death by ISIS. I'm still around, they are not. And in a way, this sort of perspective on the Middle East over those elapsed 50 years is something which is both an attempt at writing, if I may say so, an objective history, but something which is nurtured by my subjective perception. This is not something I want to hide. On the contrary, the real issue is to try to control and not to be overwhelmed by my own feelings, but to put them at a distance, particularly with the passing of time, and to try to navigate this sort of thin avenue or canal between a sort of daily empiricist approach and an ex post analysis, putting things in order, collecting data over a half century, and then trying to put things in order. That is, trying to overcome the chaos which is inherent to history in the making. And this is why I call the book, in its original French title, Sortir du Chaos, which was rendered into English as Away from Chaos. But sortir is some sort of, there's more will in it. Let's get out of chaos. I mean, it's sort of, but the translation is less harmonious in English as such. In order to get out of chaos, I mean, I'm not a politician. I'm not a ruler or an opponent or whatever. I tend to be as much of an academic as possible. And my aim is to try to organize this material, to put it into perspective, to assign a beginning and maybe a prospective end, and to retrace the logics of a peculiar history. And in doing so, as I just mentioned, we'll go back to what I assign as a beginning, and mentioning 1973 as a beginning is a choice. It is an epistemological choice, if you'd rather, because some people would say no, it's 1967, i.e. the Six-Day War and the Egyptian Nasser's defeat at the hands of the Israelis. Some others say no, this time period begins in 1979, i.e. the Iranian Revolution, Khomeini coming back from Paris, launching the Islamic Republic in Tehran, then the attack on the holy sanctuary on Mecca by super Sunni radicals, then the attack on the American embassy in Tehran, and finally on Christmas Day, the invasion of Afghanistan by the Red Army. But 1979 could only exist because of 1973. And 1967 was only a preliminary to 1973. This is what my contention to start with. I'll tell you why in a minute. And then I will try to develop a sort of dialectics of the past half century. Dialectics which will, in a way, function in a sort of Hegelian fashion, and that I will divide in three phases that I call the three phases of jihadism. One, jihadism against the nearby enemy from end of 1979 to the mid-1990s, sort of 15 to 20 years approximately. Then phase two, jihad against the faraway enemy, which was engineered, thought of, and controlled by Osama bin Laden and his Suslov, or his Goebbels, whatever you'd rather, Ayman al-Zawahiri, from 1996-97 to 2005, even though Zawahiri is still around, but he has lost his momentum. And then a third phase, which will end with ISIS, which is the sort of, as Hegel would have said in German, the Aufhebung of this dialectics, the negation of the negation, and where you don't fight against the nearby enemy, you don't fight against the faraway enemy that is America anymore. You single out Europe as a target. And this is when we had hundreds of young people from our European impoverished immigrant communities, from Birmingham, from Roubaix, from the Ruhr Valley, from Molenbeek in Belgium, and what have you, go to Syria and Iraq, where they would meet jihadists of a new type that were not focused anymore principally on enmity against the Jewish state and even against imperialism, but they were focused on their hatred against Shias and against Iran. That third phase, I believe, has more or less reached its climax with the fall of the ISIS Caliphate, whether you say that it took place in October 2017, when the city of Raqqa, which was the capital of the Caliphate, fell, or with the killing of the so-called ISIS Caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in last autumn by American forces in a Syrian village bordering Turkey. But the challenge for us now, and in order to try to understand how the Middle East will get out of chaos and how to assess those challenges, I believe, is to make sense of what happens. I'm no prophet, but I believe that if we do not go back, and if we don't go back on the past, we cannot make sense of the present, let alone predict the future. So this will be the scope of the lectures. I will have much more time than I have today, but in the sort of 20 minutes or 25 minutes that I've got left, I'll sort of draw a broad sketch of all that. Now, first, setting the stage. 1973, Egypt and Syria attack Israel. They take advantage of Yom Kippur with the help of Soviet planners. They decide on that date to take Israel by surprise. The Egyptian army crossed the Suez Canal, and the Syrian army climbs the Golan Heights, both territories that have been occupied by Israel after the Six-Day War of June 1967. In both countries, and in the rest of the Arab and Muslim world, ulama, i.e. scholars of Islam, proclaim that this is jihad. Hence, it's a holy war and soldiers can drink and eat. The first days of the offensive are a great success. Israeli prisoners are made in the Sinai, and Syrian tanks cross the Golan, and so on and so forth. The mighty Israel is in a state of shock, and so is its sponsor, mighty America. Then a lot of support, weapons, ammunition, and the like is airlifted from America to Israel, which allows, a few days after, a mighty and successful counter-offensive on the Israeli side. Israeli tanks and planes are sent to over Syria. They reach into Syria till 40 kilometers from Damascus, 30 miles from Damascus. On the Egyptian side, they cross the Suez Canal and rush to Cairo. And then they stop. Kilometer 101, because on the 16th and 17th of October, at the bequest of King Faisal, who was probably the mightiest and the wittiest of Saudi kings, a meeting of Arab oil exporting countries is summoned in Kuwait City, and the decision is taken to embargo oil to countries that support Israel and to raise prices. This suddenly creates a very significant shortage of supply, and prices skyrocket. So oil as a central commodity becomes a weapon in the arms of conservative Arabian Peninsula countries. Countries that are allied with America actually, and that found in America, even though America is hit by the rise of oil prices, because as we all are, because we're consumers at the time. Nevertheless, America is also a significant producer. And you have a whole sector of the American industry at the time, which is the oil producers, Texans in particular. George W. Bush was one of them at the time, before he was president, who sympathized with the Saudis because they benefit from the rise in the prices. And so from 1973 to 1979, you have this sort of phase where the Saudis, if I may say so, become the kings of oil. And their wealth explodes, and it allows them to become the sort of the leading party in the Middle East. The socialist, pro-Soviet Nasserites of Egypt or Baathists of Syria and Iraq, who were perceived as the epitome of Arab nationalism, just can't survive without Saudi, Kuwaiti, or Emirati or the like money. And therefore, this is a major game changer, because Saudi Arabia in particular puts forward a very conservative view of society, of politics, which is usually called Wahhabism by the name of the intellectual founder of the Saudi power system, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, an Islamic, very rigorous scholar of the late 18th century, who helped the dynasty, the Saud dynasty, to seize power. And this alliance between the turban or the saber and the holy book, Wahhabism, which is also called Salafism, a sort of strict, pure, literal adherence to the Quranic text and the hadith of the Prophet, will become the norm in order to get rid of socialism, secularism, and the like. This is not a problem for the West or for America, at least for its economic interests. Even though Europe, which has no oil, Britain will have some gas later on, suffers. And we see inflation, we see the beginning of the huge economic crisis, rising unemployment, something which will lead to delocalization or outsourcing later on towards China, and which will put Europe in this strange situation where we are now, out of which we may get out after COVID-19. You know, COVID-19 is not totally unrelated to this big change which starts then. Now, this appetite for oil and politics is being challenged in 1979 by Iran. An Islamic revolution takes place, topples Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and installs an Islamic republic headed by Ayatollah Khomeini, which sort of ups the antes of the Saudis and contends that the Iranians are the true defenders of the faith of Islam, that the Saudis are just the lackeys of the West, and that the Iranian Islamic revolution can merge with third worldist revolutions. Hence, you have a huge competition for who is the hegemon on this language of political Islam. Creates a huge chaos there again. For America, that year had started well, so they thought, because in March, Egypt and Israel had signed their peace treaty, Begin and Sadat, under the auspices of Jimmy Carter. But then the fault line moves from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. America loses Iran because the Shah is ousted. And then by the end of the year, it loses Afghanistan because of the Red Army invasion. And this is the beginning of the three phases of jihadism. But those three phases might not have happened. We cannot understand them if we do not put them into perspective, i.e., if we do not relate them with what happened between 73 and 79, which was in a way the introduction to the period, right? To this time period. Phase one, jihad against the nearby enemy. When the Soviet army invades Afghanistan, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was national security advisor of President Carter, writes to him and says, we have them. We're going to have the Reds because they made a big mistake. We're going to trap them into Afghanistan and we're going to get rid of communism. Think of Brzezinski as a Polish squire, you know, and that was what he was interested in. And he thought that, you know, trapping the Russian bear into Afghanistan was a way to win the Cold War without using nuclear weapons. They would bleed the Russian bear there, and they would not send US soldiers. No Vietnam anymore. No mothers of dead soldiers coming onto the mall in Washington. Just guys with beards that you would baptize, if I may say so, freedom fighters who were Salafists and jihadists, that would be instrumentalized, or so they thought in the Beltway at the time, against the Red Army and against the commies coming into Afghanistan. So the CIA trained and equipped those Afghan mujahideen, i.e. jihad fighters, and the oildoms and sheikhdoms of the Arabian Peninsula paid. It was called at the time the dollar for dollar match, one CIA dollar for one petrodollar. And to cut a long story short, it worked, because after 10 years, on the 15th of February 1989, the Red Army had to leave Kabul, which paved the way for the fall of the Berlin Wall a few months later, on the 11th of November 1989. The Soviet system was down. Remember 11/9, because 11/9 will be followed a little later by 9/11. But this jihad in Afghanistan was not only something that was instrumentalized by the CIA using Islamic radicals or jihadists to topple the Soviet Union. It also had a regional object. It was an issue of killing two birds with one stone. One bird was the Soviet bird and the other one was the Shia Iranian bird, because Saudi Arabia was badly challenged by Iran. It had to live up to this challenge. In October of 1979, insurgents had seized the Grand Mosque of Mecca, calling the Saud family apostates and people who worshipped the greenback more than the green book, and the round oil barrel more than the square Kaaba of Mecca. This was a big challenge, and the Iranians sort of said, we are the real true Islamists. So freeing a Muslim territory, Dar al-Islam as they say in Arabic, i.e. Afghanistan, from a non-Muslim and atheist communist enemy that was the Soviet Union, that was something that definitely would revamp Saudi Arabia. But in a way, this did not work out, because no one paid attention to the 15th of February. When I asked my students in 1989 why, they don't have a clue usually. And I said, well, it's because of what happened the day before. What was the day before? And they say, think I'm crazy, but they say it was 14th of February, sir. And I say, what was 14th of February this year? One student says, well, it was Valentine's Day. I say, yes, it's a good answer, but it's not the right answer. It was the day of Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa sentencing Salman Rushdie to death. And in doing so, the Iranian establishment sort of pulled the carpet under the Sunni jihadists. They won the media war, and they managed to capture the world's attention. It was more important for the media scene and for every one of us who read newspapers at the time when we still read newspapers, that, you know, a British citizen, even though his name was Salman Rushdie by Muslim standards, he was a Muslim and an apostate, was sentenced to death. And this was a major trauma, particularly in Britain, country where free opinion is part of the basics, right? And you can read this sort of narrative that Rushdie wrote after called Joseph Anton, when he mentions his ordeal at the time, which is quite impressive and moving. It happened, but you know, he had no idea why he had been sentenced to death on the 14th of February. Once I had dinner with him in Princeton University and we discussed that. And I said, do you know why? I said, no. I said, because this was the day before the 15th of February. I thought I was, you know, the frog is crazy. He said, what happened on the 15th? I said, Soviet pullout from Kabul. Of course, it's not pleasant to understand that you've been used, you're sentenced to death, but you're a pawn in world politics. But this is how it worked. Then the Soviet Empire went down, and the jihadists who had fought in Afghanistan were of two types. The locals, the Afghan Mujahideen, meaning jihad fighters, who had done most of the job. And the foreign fighters, and we, some colleagues at the time, we coined the word jihadist, which means the same as mujahideen, but which is a linguistic creation with a Western suffix, to make this distinction between those foreign fighters and the local fighters, right? Jihadists had come from Algeria, from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, from Pakistan, even from the outskirts of some European countries at the time, few in numbers, but this was the first movement that you would see then with ISIS jihadists going to Syria. And those jihadists thought of the world in dogmatic Islamic history terms, i.e., they were convinced that they were the ones who had destroyed this sort of empire, giant with clay feet that was the Soviet Union. Just like the Prophet Muhammad and his successors had destroyed the Sassanid or the Persian Empire at the time, which was one of the two superpowers of the time, if I can use this anachronism. And then, following on the steps of the prophets and his successors and his late successors, they would turn against the other superpower, the one that had fed them, and they would bite the hand or that had fed them, which is the Byzantium of today, America. That would happen only in a very spectacular way on September 11, 2001. Now, many of those jihadists came back after 1989 when they had come from Algeria, Egypt, Chechnya, and they started to make copycat jihad battlegrounds there. We have no time to get into details. They were ultimately beaten by the police and military establishment or regimes. And in 1997, it was over. It was the defeat of this first phase of jihad. They had won in Afghanistan, but they were unable to win in Algeria, in Egypt, in Bosnia, where they had started a sort of Afghan-like jihad, also in Chechnya. And this is where bin Laden comes into the foreground. He had been active in Afghanistan with some of his foreign fighters. This was also an incubator for the mingling of radicalized Muslim Brother ideas of a thinker called Sayyid Qutb and Salafi Islamism, and this would lead to something called Salafi jihadism. But they wanted to learn from their lessons. Why have we failed? And bin Laden was the man who pulled the strings, who had the cash, but the mastermind is someone who's still alive called Ayman al-Zawahiri, an Egyptian MD from a very prominent Egyptian family of scholars of Islam and professors of medicine. And he is the one who authored an online pamphlet at the time, probably published, put online in 1996, 97, the very beginning of the web, which was called Night with a K, under the Prophet's banner, or Fursan Tahta Rayat al-Nabi in Arabic. And in this, he draws the lessons. Why did we fail? We failed because the Arab masses were still afraid of the West. If we can strike against a faraway enemy, just like our ancestors stroke against Byzantium, then the masses won't be frightened again, and we can mobilize them. So there again, to cut a long story short, they sort of started to, and it was also a means to break with America, because the first phase of jihadism was backed, paid for by America, by the CIA, trained and equipped by the CIA, because it was an anti-Soviet and anti-Iranian jihad. The symbolic break actually took place in 1993 with the first attack on the World Trade Center by Egyptian Islamists and some others. And the real break came with the attack on the American embassies in Tanzania and Kenya, and with the attack on the USS Cole, which was refueling in the harbor of Aden, and finally with 9/11 on American soil. This was, of course, a major issue. It was a very symbolic issue. It was the beginning of the Christian millennium, and this was perceived by Islamist millenarists as the first step to replace the Christian era, the dominant Christian era, by a dominant Muslim era. And it was also something that was extremely visible, because they very astutely managed to make use of the media, of television, and they sort of captured the attention of the 8 o'clock news. At the time, we were still watching television, with the language of Hollywood. You know, it was the language, the visual language of fiction, the Infernal Towers, or whatever it was called, this Hollywood movie. And then the towers, the Twin Towers, would fall. And this was watched by a bewildered world. And this was a great success, symbolically. But the capacity to send 19 people flying in the air, flying planes on towers and on the Capitol, which failed, and on the Pentagon, was very important, but it had no grassroots link. And you know, many people who were hostile to the system in general would become jihadists, even though they were not Muslims, or they would find in Islam. There were many conversions to Islam afterwards, but it was not enough to be a game changer. All the more so as America, under George Bush, when it launched its war on terror, would not target bin Laden. Actually, this was not what they had in mind. They wanted to punish Saudi Arabia and put Iraq in the place of Saudi Arabia as the main, or the swing oil producer of the region. This was something which is, of course, a traumatic experience for Britain and for America, but for Britain also, because Britain was pudelized, if I may say so, by America at the time. When Tony Blair, as they said, sexed up the weapons of mass destruction file, so that the Commons, together with the Congress in Washington, would vote for the war. Saddam Hussein had no means to threaten the West significantly, or not as it was mentioned, but the destruction of Saddam Hussein's regime was a means to bring forward a Shia majority political establishment or government, Iraq being majority Shia. Because at the time, many Iraqi Shiite exiles in Washington sold to the Beltway people, or to the neoconservatives, that Shia Arab Islam in Iraq was the best ally of the West and of America. That it would punish the Saudis for sheltering bin Laden and his likes, and it would also show the Iranians that the fate of Shias was to be friends of the West and eventually of Israel. And therefore, the Iranian masses would topple their Ayatollah regime and the like. This was, if I may say so, the pipe dream of the neocons. It did not really work, but it was not a great issue for bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, because they had tried to start a jihad in Iraq, a Sunni jihad in Iraq, just like the one in Afghanistan before, but they just didn't pay attention to the fact that the majority of Iraqis were Shias. And even though it was a very harsh war for the Western armies that were there at the time, the French didn't go, and we were chastised as stinking cheese eating weasel at the time by our British and American friends. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, Iran came into Iraq to the rescue of America and Britain. This was when they ended. This is where phase 2 ended. Then we had a third phase of jihadism, which was ISIS. ISIS, which built its capacity on radicalized children of immigrants in Europe and blended those radicalized kids with Levant issues after the Arab uprisings of years 2010, 2011. That led to this third phase of jihadism. It was not top-down jihadism, as was the case with Al-Qaeda, but rather bottom-up jihadism. And it was a true and fro movement from Europe to Syria and Iraq and return, with attacks on British territory, on French territory, on Belgian territory, on German territory, mostly Spanish territory, which led to the creation of this ISIS caliphate of sorts, and which also led at the end of the day with the destruction of the ISIS caliphate by the combined bombings of Western plains and attacks of Iraqi Shias and Syrian Kurds on the ground, which reintroduced the Levant in a sort of new great game, because the country that managed to come in from the cold, if I may say so, at the time was the Soviet Union. There was Russia, sorry, the successor state to the Soviet Union, that used its army and its might, its intelligence service, to boost the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, and that allowed it to that day to survive in spite of the defeat of ISIS. So here we are now with a Middle East region in shambles, which is very hardly hit by the crash of the oil prices. The crash of the oil prices was decided by Russia, and Saudis could only but follow trail, because shale oil producers in America had gained the upper hand in the market. They produced so much oil, but their oil was so costly. And when Russia decided to boost its oil production, they thought that this would throw the prices down. Then this would oust the American oil producers who couldn't compete because shale oil is much more expensive to produce, to extract, to drill. This started with COVID-19. COVID-19 led, as everybody knows, to a halt of the world economy, therefore to a much lower demand for oil worldwide, starting with China. And this, of course, is something that puts the Middle East in a totally different situation than we were before. Even if oil prices come up again, they will not be sufficient to pay for the development of those countries. And this is a challenge which has been seen by a number of rulers, including by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, who has developed a vision for the post-oil periods in the kingdom and in the peninsula. It's not for me to decide on how history will judge or will not judge Mohammed bin Salman or Mohammed bin Zayed, the ruler of United Arab Emirates, but their vision, to some extent, takes into consideration that this half-century of oil reign based on the spread of Islamism and Salafism, which was characterized by this jihad thing, which at the end of the day turned also against them. This era is over in the Middle East. And what I wanted to show in this book, Away from Chaos, and what I would like to develop at length in our conversation in the Birkbeck Lectures, would be to try to understand where we are now. After the three phases of jihad, after the failure of the Arab Springs of the early 2010s, where is the Middle East and the Mediterranean heading? Can they turn to a manufacturing or service economy rather than a rentier economy with entrepreneurs and a labor force? Can they benefit from the reshoring or relocalization of the supply chain that was outsourced massively to China, with the adverse political and economic consequences that we just witnessed? Because the China of tomorrow is not going to be the China of yesterday. How will this region find its place in a world system which is changing, with three poles emerging: China, America, Europe? You'll decide where is Britain in that. And could we create a more integrated economic and political zone based on Europe, the Mediterranean basin, and its southern and eastern shores into parts of Africa and Asia? This, I believe, is one of the big challenges of tomorrow, and it assumes that this radicalization of Islam that was made possible by a sort of spiraling that started in 1973 can be reversed. It's probably too early to pass a judgment or to make a prediction, but I believe that this is something that can be open to analysis, to hypothesize what the future of the Middle East might be. So I think it is high time that I stop here. And this, as I said, was only an introduction to the Birkbeck Lectures of next year in Cambridge, and I'm now open to questions if there are any. Thank you so much for listening to me.